You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. More than 1 in 10 people in Washington state rely on Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, aka SNAP benefits. Most of those recipients are in households with children, and all of them will get cut off from those benefits on Friday, October 31st, if the partial federal government shutdown doesn't end by then. On Tuesday, Governor Ferguson said he will direct over $2 million in weekly food aid to state food banks should the shutdown continue. That program will start November 3rd. But is it enough to make up for the loss of SNAP benefits? Reporter Alexandra Yoon-Hendricks has been covering all of this for the Seattle Times, and she joins me now with more. Alex, thanks for being on Soundside. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So nearly 930,000 people in Washington state rely on these benefits. How does the state plan to plug some of these gaps, and how will it distribute this money? What do we know?
So we know that when people are cut off from their SNAP benefits, the last resort that people have really are food pantries and food banks. And already these service providers have been bracing for these SNAP cuts for a number of weeks, given the ongoing shutdown. So I think the hope is that this $2 million, $2.2 million that the state plans on delivering to food banks might be able to shore up some of that demand. We don't know just yet. Like, I've asked state officials for more clarification on what those allocations to food banks might actually look like. How many pounds of food we're talking about will be able to go out to communities each week. It's really hard to overstate how drastic this will be. As you said, 1 in 10 people in the state rely on SNAP. This is a lifeline for people. It is how people keep their fridges full and their pantries stocked. Yeah.
And so what we're talking about here, just so people understand the scope of the problem, is people who are typically able to go to the grocery store, use those SNAP benefits, and purchase food for their families. They will then, once these benefits run out, and at the end of the month, they will have to go and likely turn to food pantries, to food banks, right, to sustain themselves. I mean, do I understand that correctly?
That's right. Here in Washington, I believe the average monthly benefit is around $320. And I've talked to service providers who've said that they've had conversations with people who are making really hard choices about how am I going to pay my bills, pay my rent, or put food on the table. And so, yeah, these food banks are really a last resort for people to keep their families fed. And the food banks that I've talked to, they've said that the demand that they experienced during the pandemic never went away. And they, like everyday people, are also facing rising food costs. They're experiencing difficulty in recovering food. The amount of food that they're able to recover from grocery stores has been getting smaller and smaller each month. They're also struggling. A lot of these food banks are nonprofits, and they are also feeling the squeeze with the reduction in state and federal funding. So it's really like a perfect storm in terms of an increase of demand, an increase in need, and a lot of these food banks and service providers are going to be doing the best they can to meet that demand, but it'll be a struggle for them for sure.
And to be clear, this is $173 million you report in monthly food benefits that Washingtonians receive. And again, 1 in 10 state residents on these SNAP benefits. And the state is talking about an extra $2.2 million sent to food banks in order to try to plug that gap. But that is a huge delta between where the federal dollars were, and they're set to dry up, and where the state has been able to step in so far. I mean, what are you hearing from food banks in terms of what are they expecting once these SNAP benefits run out?
I think they are expecting already, their lines are already out the door right now. And next week, these food banks are expecting even longer lines. They're expecting a number of people who have never even come to the food bank. For a lot of people, the SNAP benefits that they have been receiving have allowed them to avoid having to go to food banks. So they're expecting people who have never come to the food bank to start showing up, or people who haven't showed up since the pandemic, since they lost a job coming to the food bank. To take a step back, a lot of food banks already put limits on the amount of eggs or dairy products that individuals are able to pick up when they visit the food bank. And I've talked to a couple of food banks that have said that they may need to implement further restrictions on even more products because of what demand might look like next week. I talked to one food bank and they said that they had received, dozens of calls from people asking just, hey, I've heard that my SNAP benefits are going to be cut off. Is that true? These food banks are basically saying, yes, it's true. And every one of those calls they are expecting will result in that, those individuals coming to the food bank the following week.
And why is this happening? We've seen shutdowns before. This is the first time I can remember that SNAP benefits are actually set to cut off. What is going on behind the scenes here with the federal agency, the Department of Agriculture, which is the administrator of SNAP benefits?
SNAP is a federal program, but it is delivered to individuals through the states. And so the US Department of Agriculture issued a notice a few weeks ago telling states, hey, do not distribute November benefits, do not plan to distribute November benefits, because of insufficient funds, because of this ongoing shutdown. Now, there is some contingency funds that the US Department of Agriculture does have to help potentially buoy this SNAP program. It's about $5 billion that they have in contingency funds, and Democrats and local leaders and public advocates have been pushing the USDA to release this contingency funds to help prop up the program for another month as the shutdown continues. Over the weekend, the US Department of Agriculture said that they will not be releasing this $5 billion in contingency funds. Their argument basically being that this contingency funds is exclusively for things like serving people in disaster areas or after after a natural disaster or wildfires or whatnot. I think it's worth mentioning that Democrats and a number of advocacy groups have said that that is an incorrect reading of how this contingency funds could be used. And also on Tuesday, Washington, along with 24 other Democratic states, sued the federal government over the halting of this USDA funding for the SNAP program. And so Democratic leaders are also hoping that potentially this legal effort might result in the disbursement of SNAP funding that all of these states need, but it remains yet to be seen whether this legal effort or whether a deal brokered in Congress might come before November 1st, when people really are expecting this food assistance to go out.
And that lawsuit over the release of that contingency fund, we just don't know how fast that would play out and what the outcome might be. So as you say, food banks are bracing. People who are on SNAP benefits are looking for answers. I'm going to repeat some advice in your story here, Alexandra, that says that people who are seeking food resources can go to the state's agricultural department website. They can also call 360-725-5640. Again, I'm going to say that number again, 360-725-5640. You said it. This is a really tough time. Anytime food benefits would be reduced, but to cut off food benefits right as we go into the holiday season, can you just leave us maybe with a thought about especially childhood hunger in our state and what that looks like and what this could mean?
I talked to a SNAP recipient yesterday. She's 81 years old. She is raising by herself on a fixed income her great grandson, who's 6 years old. They don't receive a lot in SNAP money, but the money that they do receive means her great grandson gets dairy, milk, cheese, juice. He loves fruits. Um, when I talked to her and I asked her what she plans on doing, she said, I don't know. She is struggling to navigate these next few days. And what will end up happening is that she will not let her, great grandson go hungry. She will be the one struggling to eat because she's not going to make sure she's going to make sure that her kid is fed. But countless families in Washington are going to be making this really hard choice over the next few weeks if this crisis isn't addressed.
That's the problem right here, right? Is that, there are bigger forces going on. There are congressional fights over healthcare costs going up for millions of Americans. There are real policy disagreements that are very important. But right now, with this shutdown, that 81-year-old trying to raise her grandson and making sure he has dairy to eat is what we're talking about here when we talk about SNAP benefits being cut off. I know that I have started looking into ways that I can better support our local food banks here, Alexandra, and I do hope for those in our audience, it's a public radio audience, this is a generous audience that cares about their neighbors, and I do personally hope that others will join me in that and look at ways that we can help support these food banks that were already struggling ahead of this cutoff of SNAP benefits and the wave of need that is going to hit starting on Saturday. Alexandra Yoon-Hendricks covers race and equity for the Seattle Times, and she's been talking about how SNAP recipients in Washington state are facing this cutoff from benefits if the government shutdown continues. Anything else you want to leave our audience with, Alex, here before we go?
When I ask food banks, what can people do? They basically say two things. One, volunteer your time, and two, donate. If you can run a food drive at your place of employment, now is the time to do it. If you can donate to these food banks, now is the time to do it.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.